So we will start with this panel on the perspective of local election administrators, and then we're going to turn to the election law panel right after. So I'm going to turn it over now to John Fortier. Thanks, John.
All right, good morning, and if you could take your seats, that would be great. This is a panel that is entitled, I know Rick was looking for cheery panels and optimism, The View from the Ground, the Role of Election Administrators in Avoiding Pitfalls. We've got the ground, we've got pitfalls. The good news is the old title was A View from the Abyss, so it's improved a little bit. We want to thank you all for coming here. You are obviously election junkies, and as a reward, again, Rick has something for you. That is a subscription to a new television station just off the presses. It's called C-SPAN 8. It follows the personal lives of election administrators 24 hours a day. So watch for these people coming. One other thing, this is a short panel, but we do want to get to your questions. So we're going to talk a little while, and then we're going to, you'll have pieces of paper in the room that you can write your questions on. They'll bring those questions up to me. I will transform them into a barcode, which will become the question of record. And then we will, well, leave that part up. But your questions are important. We will get to them. So briefly, we have three people with lots of experience and connection to the election administration world. So I will give very short introductions. The longer bios are in your packets. But Tina Epps-Johnson, to my left here, is the Executive Director for the Center of Technology and Civic Life. Patty Hansen is the County Recorder for Coconino County in Flagstaff, Arizona. Has spent a career in other places as well, in Minnesota, Nebraska, in the elections world. And Neil Kelly is the hometown election administrator, the Registrar of Voters in Orange County, where, of course, there's nothing going on in the next few days. So, he spares some time for us. We really appreciate it. What I'd really like to do is get the local perspective on, a few things. One, what's new in elections? Some of it's good. There's change and reform. What about the problems of change? We're putting in new systems. We're worried about how those interact with voters coming to the polling place and how people might question the legitimacy or how things might not look as good on the outside, and also questions of technology. So I guess I want to start, maybe I can start at the end with Neil, since he is here and since he has an election coming up very soon. You have some new things in California. Maybe you can say a little bit about that. And then I guess I do want to press you on the question of, many people will talk about this in later panels, but we do have issues of the reporting of results and how quickly they come in and what that means for the public and people questioning legitimacy of election. California has a history of a longer reporting time, a longer certification time. What do you say about it, both about the new system you have and how one deals with those challenges?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to Rick and UCI for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And it's good to be here, although I'm sweating a bit because I have a very short window to get here and back to the office. So what's new in California, what's not new in California is the way I would answer that, and particularly in Orange County. So in Orange County, we are one of 15 counties that will be moving to the Voters' Choice Act for this election and all moving forward. And what that is, three basic things behind that. Every voter gets a vote by mail ballot 30 days out from Election Day. You have the opportunity to vote on 11 days instead of a single day. And we don't call that early voting, we call it 11 election days because they're all treated the same way. And then finally, and my favorite part of this is you get to go to any vote center that you want to. You're not tied to a home precinct. So if you lived, for instance, here in Irvine, but you were in Anaheim for the day, you could get a ballot for Irvine, for your precinct in Anaheim. And that's the beauty of this. It really improves the experience for the voter, and it improves the experience for our staff as well. And that's the selfish side of me. You talked about the pitfalls, I think, of things that are new. And the danger, I think, in this process is that we're not only transitioning to a new way of voting, which, by the way, this is the most historic change in voting in Orange County since it was founded in 1893, and I'm not exaggerating in that fact. It really is. But we're also introducing a new voting system. Now, for those of you questioning my wisdom up here on the panel, to do that at this time during a presidential primary, that was not my decision or choice. It all came together in very unusual circumstances through kind of politics that were involved. But at any rate, this is what we're doing. And I will say that since Saturday, we opened on Saturday, we've had a very successful launch at 38 locations around the county. We have seen almost 8,000 voters use the vote centers in person. And we have currently just shy of 300,000 vote-by-mail ballots that have been returned, which is 35% higher than 16. and it's 70% higher than 2012 at the same time period. Yeah. So I obviously, we have planned for this for several years, and the redundancies and backups that are in place are very numerous. We could have hours discussion related to that. But I will tell you, this is about as close to a military operation, I think, in the civilian world that I can think of. For the purposes of our deployment, we have 50 personnel in the field that can respond within about 5 minutes to any issue in our vote centers. And so what's great about this, and this is the part I love, is you start last Saturday and you kind of work those bugs through when it's very slow. And by the time we hit this weekend, when it's going to start really picking up, and then into Monday and Tuesday, we've kind of ironed out most of those issues. It gives us a very different feel for Election Day, I think, going into it. So I do want to talk quickly about the results. That was the second part of your question. I did a press conference yesterday with Secretary Padilla here in California talking about this very issue, about the results and how long it takes in California, and et cetera, et cetera. I can't tell you how many times I talk to members of the press and say, well, you know, we have 17, 18 million voters in California, and that's why we have 30 days to count those ballots. In 2018, and I think this is an important stat to give you, there were more ballots dropped off on Election Day than we received in the entire 30 days before Election Day. So what that does is that just starts you over for counting those ballots. Like, you know, we had 30 days before, or 10 days actually in California, and we're starting over. The data that I'm looking at right now and the trends, I think that's going to be the same thing we're going to see, folks, right? With South Carolina tomorrow and a lot of people waiting to see what the results of that are, we have people that are going to wait probably till Sunday, Monday, Tuesday to vote. That being said, I will say this. Our system here in Orange County, we have doubled the capacity for scanning, and we have doubled the capacity for processing votes post-election. I don't want you to hold me to this, but our forecast is to cut the time in half where we were in 2018. That's kind of where we're headed right now, and it looks good for that. But the reforms in California, and I just need 2 more minutes, the reforms in California are really what have extended the time period. Allowing voters to cure issues post-election, 2 weeks later, essentially, we'll certify probably 3rd week in March, and they can do it all the way up almost to certification. They didn't sign their ballot, their signature didn't match, they have 3 days after Election Day for us to receive the ballot. All of those things extend the time period. Even if you're caught up, you have to wait for those things to pan out before you can move towards certification. So that's one of the challenges in a state with a lot of reforms, which I think are good because it's assisting voters, which is great. It just extends the time period for certification.
And I know much of this is beyond your control, but maybe if I could put a finer point to it. You know, polls show that Bernie Sanders is doing pretty well in California. Possibility of the delay of results might mean that his supporters say, hey, we did really well in the biggest state, one with the most Democratic delegates. Other results maybe didn't go quite as well, and it's being delayed. Does that worry you? And 2, I guess, are you able to, do you think we will have a sense of the results that is accurate enough to people get the gist of what happened in the election or not? I mean, we have the thresholds also, not only who won, but who made the threshold. It's a complicated process for determining delegates. What kind of information, how much information do you think we'll hear about the day after?
Well, here I can speak to Orange County, and then I'll just touch briefly on the other counties in California. In Orange County, we will, at 8:05 on election night, report all of the vote by mail received as of Monday night. So you're talking about a big chunk of those votes will be processed, including all of the in-person ballots that have been cast from last Saturday through tonight. Those will be posted at 8:05 on Tuesday. What will not be posted right at 8:05 will be the precinct results cast from Saturday through Election Day, and we'll process those, be done about 10:30 that night. So the only thing left, John, after that is what everybody drops off on Election Day. That's the big unknown. The beauty, though, of a vote center county is you eliminate almost every provisional ballot. And provisional ballots were the ones that took 2 weeks post-election to process. We've been processing same-day registrations every day that they're being cast right now. So we're ahead of the curve on that. I want to go back to your comment about Bernie Sanders. I got to know a lot of his supporters very well in 2016. They were in my office in large numbers. And to their credit, you know, they really took the time to understand the process. And I think that, yes, I'm worried about those things, but at the end of the day, if we communicate properly and we certainly lay out how many ballots are left and communicate that very effectively, that helps to take air out of the tire, right? I mean, that really does help.
So maybe I can turn to Patty. You also are in a state that has a lot of vote by mail and takes a little bit longer time to count, and some people think might be a swing state in the fall. But you also have some, I think, some interesting thoughts about what election officials are expected to do today compared to what they were 30 years ago, the vast array of responsibilities they have and how that contributes to the process.
Well, thank you, John, for pointing out how old I am, that I've been doing this over 30 years.
It's only second grade.
I appreciate that. Well, yes, just to give you a little bit of background about our county. We're the second largest county geographically in the U.S. behind San Bernardino, and a little bit larger than Riverside. But we have 140,000 population. About a third of our county is Native Americans. We have the part of the Navajo Nation. We have 2 villages of the Hopi tribe, and we have the Havasupai tribe located at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And you cannot drive there, so you either take a 9-mile hike, or you helicopter down, or ride a horse or a mule. So we have some unique challenges for conducting elections.
Do you have provisional mules, though, just in case? Yeah,
We actually looked at, could we use a drone to take the election results out of the canyon? Unfortunately, there's 5 FAA regulations that we couldn't figure out how to get around. So that will be coming out of the canyon by foot. So we also are covered by the Navajo Language Voting Rights Act, Section 203. And the state was covered by Spanish. It's no longer statewide, but our county still provides Spanish translation and interpreters. Oh, and I did mention we have that hole in the middle of the ground, in the middle of our county, the Grand Canyon. So to get to the Fredonia, which is a town in the northeast or northwest corner of our county, it's a 3.5-hour drive. The state has now gone to, everybody has new ballot tabulation equipment. We can no longer modem results, so all of those are having to be brought to Flagstaff for tabulation on election night. And we were getting done about 11 or 11:30 at night for a large election. I'm hoping we'll be done by 4 or 5 the next morning. So results for our county will be slow. Now, the majority of the population is in Flagstaff, which will be counted. And as Neil said, we count all of our early, or essentially their absentee ballots that we've received up to Monday evening. That's the results released at 8 p.m. And that's about usually 60 to 65% of our voters are included in that first count. As you mentioned, one thing I'd like to point out is election administrators, at least the ones I know, in those 30-some years I've been doing this, we're being asked now to be experts in areas where we were no longer experts. We're expected to be experts in technology, in the law, in the media and communication, logistics on how to get things out and back, security, partly being a therapist. There's a lot of angry voters out there. And I talk to them almost daily, and they're scared too. They're concerned, is their vote going to count, and how we can reassure them. We have to be experts in accessibility, so to ensure that our voters with disabilities can have their voices heard on an equal basis as the rest of our voters. Also language assistance. We now conduct in Arizona essentially 3 different types of elections at the same time. Early voting, which is really in Arizona absentee voting, you can vote in person or by mail, starts 27 days prior to the election. Essentially, we do a ballot by mail. 60-some% of our voters are on our permanent early voting list, so they're mailed a ballot prior to their election. And then election day election. So it's all of those things put a large demand on county administrators. I have 11 staff to cover an area that's larger than 14 states. So we're always looking at ways that we can improve, but as everybody probably in this room, it's never enough money to do everything that we need to do. We do work on contingency plans. We're constantly, to be successful as an election administrator, you have to start thinking of worst case scenarios and planning for it. Nothing goes correctly 100% how you think it is going to go. There's other types of problems I'm concerned about, I know right now. Besides the technology part, can we get into our polling places on election morning? Political observers. Political observers are now a huge problem for us in that our polling places are not that large anyway, and we have all of these political parties, candidates, advocacy groups that want to be in there standing over our poll workers who get paid a whole $80 for a 15, 16-hour day. So that's difficult. I always worry about snow. I know we're in Arizona, but we have mountains, and Flagstaff averages 100 inches of snow a year. So weather's a problem. And then this one is really scaring me, illness, the flu or the coronavirus. And so we're gearing up buying lots of hand sanitizer, and we're actually looking at buying masks because I'm afraid our poll workers are going to say, I don't want to work, I might get sick. Violence near or at polling places, and running out of supplies. So just giving you a little uplifting overview of election administration. I'm sorry, I hope I answered your question.
That's perfect. Let me turn to Tiana, because you work with election officials across the country. I know particular interest, maybe Michigan and Pennsylvania, who have some new systems, but give us a sense of what you see going on out there, maybe the good of new things, but also some of the worries and the challenges of change.
I first want to put a finer point on what Patty mentioned about the expanding responsibilities of local election officials and what a typical local election office looks like. About 90%. How about now? Okay. About 90% of election jurisdictions in the country are small to mid-sized. And on average, they have between 2 and 4 staff members to do all of the things that Patty just mentioned. In addition to that, many of these local jurisdictions also are doing things like issuing marriage licenses or being the front lines of the DMV. So these growing responsibilities require that we are making sure that we are providing clear training and tools to these local offices so that they're able to adapt to the needs of today's voters. And we're seeing one of the biggest challenges that officials are having across the country is keeping pace with new technology and understanding how to effectively do that outreach and communication to voters. And that leads to a cultural change, one of the biggest ones that I'm seeing across the country right now, which is that traditionally, the work of election officials has been something that has largely happened behind the scenes. You don't hear about the work in the election department unless something goes wrong. And for many election officials, that's their comfort place, is being out of the spotlight and doing the work of implementing the law and effectively administering elections. But as we heard on the first panel today, there's a great need for election officials to be ensuring the confidence in elections and providing transparency into their processes. And that requires a cultural shift in election officials being public-facing and being comfortable in using digital tools to do outreach to voters. So I want to talk about a few really practical things that I think that election officials can do between now and November to ensure the integrity of elections that really focus on communication to voters and transparency. And again, that are really pragmatic. 1, election websites. about a little bit over 900 counties don't have a basic election website with voting information on it. Of course, every state has an election website that has statewide information, but so much of the really specific information that informs how you specifically vote in your jurisdiction is relative to the specific locality that you live in. So if there is no website that has that information on it, there's a huge information gap. And when there's huge information gaps from the trusted source of that information, it creates the environment in which misinformation or disinformation thrives. So local election officials must first have a website, but those websites also have to answer voters' most pressing questions in a way that is presented in clear, plain language. We know from research that about 40% of US adults have low literacy. That impacts the way that information has to be presented to be understood, and it also has implications for design of websites in the first place. There also has to be really clear signals that this information is official information. One really practical thing that we could do between now and November is get every local election website to have a .gov domain. So right now, many election websites are .com or .org. That .gov signifier is really important to knowing that that is the place that you're going for trusted information. So there could be investments in campaigns within states to do that. And what comes with the .gov domain also is some sort of minimal security protocols that ensure that those websites are more secure. This information also has to take into consideration voters' different information needs and understand the needs of voters with disabilities, and in considering that when you're putting information out in digital channels. For many election offices, not only is being public-facing something that is not particularly comfortable or not natural to how they've done their work historically, but also it takes a certain amount of savvy to be effective at being able to put information out through social media, where many people are getting this information. So election officials need tools and training to understand how to do that well, and need to be building relationships with key messengers and media allies to be able to make sure that this information is getting in front of their voters. We heard in the last panel about this hyper-local challenge. That points to the reason why it's really important for all of these local election jurisdictions to have some presence and to try to fight through the noise of what's going to be happening through these digital channels.
I want to follow up with you on one point, but I want to remind you that we are looking for your barcoded questions to come up here. So we're almost ready for you. We're going to talk a little bit more, but please contribute and we'll hear from you. All of you, but maybe Tiana in particular, we're hearing a lot about this being a very high turnout election.
Yes.
A lot of signs of people being enthusiastic. That comes with challenges. I know that we certainly have jurisdictions here which are heavily vote by mail, and there are challenges there, but there are also places that are much more traditional, polling places. So from what you see around the country and things that are happening, what would be your worries and some advice to places regarding what potentially is a lot of turnout coming, and then the reaction that people will have to those sorts of delays?
I often get asked, what's giving me hope about the 2020 election? And I always point to the fact that all the experts are saying that there's going to be massive turnout. We've seen data about how enthusiasm is off the charts for the election. But the flip side to that, one of the things that keeps me up at night is that in order to administer a high turnout election requires having poll workers that are sufficient to staff and equip these polling places on election day. Poll workers are volunteers that have the most direct effect on our experience on election day. And if you are the type of person that's looking for this in the news, there are headlines coming out across the country where election jurisdictions are raising the flag that they are desperate for more poll workers and that they are falling short of the staffing and equipment that they need to be able to effectively run a polling place. When you don't have enough poll workers, you see things like long lines, for example. And so one of the things that I think we really need to focus on are initiatives to be able to support election officials in effectively recruiting poll workers. There are great models across the country about the ways that, in particular, the business community can partner with election departments to, for example, give their staff the day off so that they all can be poll workers. So those are the types of things that we should be looking at being able to replicate more at scale across election jurisdictions. You all, as voters, should consider volunteering to be a poll worker. It's an incredible opportunity to see how the process works in action. It's also a way that you can have a direct impact on making sure that elections are secure and are run properly. So that is one area where I think that we really need to be deeply investing in something that is oftentimes not really focused on when we are having these discussions about the ways to prevent operational challenges on Election Day.
Okay, I'm going to turn to some questions. I have some other things I want to talk about, but I think some of the questions are going to get to this. So here's a question. Is there any proof of interference in the 2016 election, or is this fear caused by the media? And this is submitted by Vladimir. Sorry. But I want to rephrase that question a bit, because I don't expect you to, I mean, certainly you can comment directly on the 2016 election, but especially as local election officials, certainly things are going on. There are partnerships with the federal government, there are work with the states, so some talk about what kind of infrastructure, how it's being protected. But I also want you to think about the disinformation that we talked about in the last panel. You as election officials sometimes have to deal with that. It's not your creation. People are sometimes telling people, the polling places are closed, or wrong information about the voting process. What do you do as election officials that tries to react to that?
So I'll take that first. So I am honored to be on the Homeland Security Election Security Task Force. And we've been doing a lot of work on that task force to work to educate, like Tiana talked about, 9,000 roughly jurisdictions around the country about the importance of physical, cyber, and social protections for election officials. And I think we've done a lot of good work, but it's a large ocean to boil. And I will tell you, just specifically in Orange County, when it comes to misinformation, we get phone calls. We're averaging right now about 1,200 phone calls per day through our phone bank. That's going to go up probably to about 8,000 to 10,000 as we hit into the weekend. And a lot of the phone calls we're getting is, I read on the internet, X, Y, and Z. And I'm very thankful that they're calling our office for that official information. We are using tools now as well that are embedded into our social media feeds that we can just click a button and it sends information to the social media company about this is probably an incorrect post or it's a bogus post. And it happens instantly, and it also sends that same data and information to our federal partners as well on the law enforcement side. So those kinds of tools, I think, are really valuable, and we need to start spreading those around as well.
I think the problem we have is a lot of times it's errors that people are accusing it of misinformation or on purpose. People make mistakes. And for example, in 2016, you may have heard about our largest county in Arizona, Maricopa County, at their presidential preference election that had long lines at some locations. They were being accused of doing this to suppress the vote. I know those people, and what they did is they tried to go to vote centers. They cut down on the number of locations way too far, and that was a mistake. It was not an effort to purposely suppress the vote. So that's kind of frustrating. I know in 2018, I got a call from an attorney, since we're at a law school, I'll talk about this, who started screaming at me that we ran out of ballots at a polling place. And no, we didn't. I could calmly say we sent 800 ballots. Our electronic poll book is working, and we've had 320 some voters. So we have not run out of ballots. Well, we co-locate with the Navajo Nation for their elections. They have it on the same election day. They ran out of ballots, but all of a sudden it was us, and it's on, going on the airways that there's a huge problem with the elections. So it's really hard to make sure that we look at things that it's not being done purposefully to affect the election. It's just common mistakes and problems.
So I want Tiana to weigh in on this too, but there's a question directed to her which is related, and I think gets a little bit of a different twist to it. It says, would you please address young and first-time voter in the room? Why is it urgent for our students to vote and participate in this election? I'm going to amend or add to the question and say, Also, what are the challenges of first-time voters? And if we're talking about there being bigger turnout, that by definition means that there are people who are not as familiar with the voting place. What are election officials doing about that? How do those challenges get resolved?
It's imperative that we all turn out to vote. One of the things that I like to remember is that something that I heard that really resonated with me. We can opt out of the process of voting, but we can't opt out of the outcome. We need to have a say on the outcome. We have to show up. Now to the point of what are the specific needs of new voters? And that could be young voters or people that are interacting with the process for the first time. When we think about the most pressing questions that people have before an election, there's one unique question that new voters, people who have never interacted with the process have, which is basically, where do I start? New voters need the process demystified. They need to understand what is going to happen when I go to a polling place. What are the different things that I need to know ahead of time? What are the options that are available to me? It's a really big question, and just that sort of anxiety of not knowing is a really specific thing that local election officials and election officials in general can address by adding more information about just what to expect in the process itself and doing that work of demystifying it to reduce that anxiety and to extend those invitations to welcome people into the process.
Great. So, Neil, as you might expect, you have some of your voters in the room, and they're interested in some things about Orange County voting. So I've got three I'm going to quickly combine, and you can see what the answer to these are. How are the vote-by-mail ballots counted, by hand or by machine? Second, California quietly implemented ballot harvesting a few years ago. That is ripe for ballot manipulation by the harvesters. How do you guarantee the chain of custody of ballots is sacred? And finally, will the number of vote centers open 11 days before Election Day be expanded for the general election?
Okay, so I'll take the first one, which is the vote-by-mail process. The vote-by-mail processing starts with the capturing of the signature through an automated process. When that does happen, we then compare the signature to the original signature on file. One of the nice things about our system is that we are collecting historical signatures as well. So many of you in the room might have 25 signatures on file with my office, and we look at every single one of those when we're making comparisons. All of this is done by human beings. It's not done by software. I've looked at the software. I don't trust it. I don't think it works very well. And the humans can do a pretty fast pace, but a deliberate pace in reviewing those. The challenge with them, and I will tell you this, is the more that we see registrations occurring at DMV here in California and those signatures transferring over to our data, sometimes they look like crayon signatures, and it's very difficult to make those comparisons. But we do our best, and we certainly err on the side of the voter. The second, I'm going to take the third question because that's one I remember, which is the vote centers expanding for the general election. Very possible. We're going to be looking at that data as we move through the primary and moving forward. We currently will have just shy of 200 vote centers open for the primary election, and we'll closely monitor that turnout and traffic and the metrics because we need to start looking at that for the general, of course, with the high volume. And one thing I want to add to that, John, you talk about lines on election day and the challenges of that. Tiana's right. If you don't have enough poll workers, that certainly is a piece of it. The other piece, though, is the bottleneck is always at the check-in station. Mm-hmm. Always. Mm-hmm. I saw Charles earlier, and he's got some great data on where those check-ins are, and we use Charles's queuing theory in our analysis. So we purchased 4 check-in stations. So now you take out that bottleneck and relieve some of that pressure. And the second question I don't remember.
It was ballot harvesting.
Thank you. How could I forget that one?
Sure, you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, so when I was president of our statewide association, that bill was before the legislature, it came out of the legislature and before the governor. And I was vocally opposed to it because I think that it does create not only an optics issue, but it also just creates challenges on that chain of custody. In California right now, you can, as an individual, knock on a door, ask a person if you don't mind them giving you your ballot, and then you can take it to our office within 3 days. That's the requirement. There's no requirement that you put your name and address on that ballot, though. There's a place for you to do it, and it's suggested, but there's not a requirement in the law. In Colorado, they have the same law, but it allows the harvester to only collect 10 ballots at a time. In California, it's unlimited. So an individual could go around and collect quite a few. I will say this about this, though. I think the internet did a great job of kind of exaggerating the issue related to ballot harvesting, because a lot of the voters we've talked to don't want to give their ballot to a stranger. And by the way, that's bipartisan. You know, we're seeing that across the board. So the numbers that came in 18 were a lot smaller than what were being reported. I will tell you that for sure. But it's hard to quantify because they're not required to put the data on the ballot.
Okay, so I have a question which I think Patty, I mean, Neil may have something to say about this too, but Patty, especially you, could you elaborate on the compliance with Section 203 of the VRA and its language minority requirements? How do you do it? What percentage of county states are in compliance? Or maybe you could talk about your county. And I will add, if I'm not mistaken, I think you have challenges in some of the Native American languages are actually not written languages. So there's sort of additional level of challenges. You want to speak to these?
That's correct. The Navajo language is an oral language, and our Navajo voters that need language interpretation don't read or write Navajo. So all of our translation is done orally. So the best way to reach people with voting information we find is at meetings to provide information. Radio ads are a big thing. We don't have a television station in our county, so it's not like we can put out television information. But we are looking at doing more with the internet, expanding on voting that way. We find that our elderly Navajos will have a cell phone a lot of times that they check Facebook to stay in touch with their family, though a big chunk of our county does not have Wi-Fi. So it's basically face-to-face. One thing we've done with the Navajo Nation is the 3 counties in Arizona and 1 county in Utah and the counties in New Mexico that make up the Navajo Nation. Our Native American outreach staff has worked with the Navajo Election Administration to create an election glossary, because Navajo is not only an oral language, it's a descriptive language. So it's not word-to-word translation. For example, to translate our general election ballot in November 2018, it was 45 minutes because we had an example, legalizing recreational marijuana was on the ballot. So the term for marijuana is not marijuana, it was more the smoke that makes you crazy kind of stuff, which can kind of influence maybe the outcome, but that's how things have to be described. So we have those challenges with it. We have translators too, Navajo translators at each of our reservation polling places on the Navajo Nation. We also have a Hopi translator at our Hopi polling place. And our Native American outreach staff create guides with graphics to help the translators to be able to translate the ballot. They also do specialized training for those poll workers that will be translators.
I'll let Neil weigh in when I ask this other question, if you wanted to talk about VRA, but we're near the end of our panel, so I've got one last question maybe you could all say a little something about, and it's a broad question, I'm probably gonna narrow it a bit. Given COVID-19, can Trump call off the 2020 election? Now that is something that maybe some of our legal panels will think about maybe at that level, but I wanna, for you local election officials, think about the things that go wrong at every election. I mean, obviously there could be big things, hurricanes or floods, but a polling place that loses power, your connection to the live database goes down, no poll workers show up. Think about the kinds of contingencies that you have. And again, you've probably got about 1 minute each to just highlight something. So, Tiana, do you want to start?
One contingency that I know that we have in Chicago and Illinois is that if the power goes out, the technology has backup batteries that will last at least 4 hours. So it's one of the many contingencies that are taken into account when thinking about the many different things that could possibly go wrong. And I feel quite confident in the expertise of election officials and being really diligent at contingency planning. Even in social spaces, there's just this reflexive need to always think about, okay, but what if this place isn't open, where are we going next? It's something that's really in the DNA of election officials.
Patty?
Yeah, I agree with that. As I mentioned in the beginning remarks I did, we always try to plan for worst case scenario. I will tell you it doesn't help with problems sleeping. You'll find election officials are really sleep deprived because we wake up in the middle of the night thinking, oh my gosh, what if this happens? What are we gonna do? So, but yeah, you don't get do-overs and you don't get to cancel elections. I was working on 9/11 in Minnesota, and we had an election going on, and we couldn't cancel the election.
So 3 things in the last 5 years: active shooter, bomb scare, and fire are 3 things that we dealt with on Election Day. And we have a very robust plan in place, including 2 full mobile units that we can take out and set up, which we did in the bomb scare case, and redirected voters to the mobile unit, and they were able to go into that trailer and vote without delay. We also have 15 rapid deployment teams in the field at all times that are radio dispatched to turn over vote centers and to deal with technical issues, as well as 30 supervisors in the field. So we have a really strong, robust plan in place for dealing with those issues if they crop up. And also, I'm looking for a place to put a corral for mules in Santa Ana so that I can bring in mules.
If I can add, I think you are the election administrator, I heard talked about always having the list of contacts ahead of time. So you're not trying to find the phone number to the correct person, am I correct?
I have said that before. We do have a playbook that we use, both internal and external, that we can go to and go through a checklist and activate a lot of things very quickly.
Well, I know that the panel title might have been a little depressing, but I feel a little bit better given the ways in which local election officials are trying to deal with some of these issues. So I'd like to thank the panel. Hope you would join me, and go to the next one.